All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you for joining us. My name is Lindsay Hamill. I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs here at UCR Arts, the California Museum and the California Museum of Photography and the Culver Center of the Arts. Thank you for joining us today for Unearthing Black Histories Through Photography, Valley Truck Farms, and Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition. Before we begin, I'd like to first acknowledge the very difficult moment that our neighbors in Los Angeles and that many of us here are facing with the raids by ICE and the National Guard being deployed against protesters this very weekend. Today's program focuses on another example of the erasure of people of color. And during this difficult time, I'm glad to be here in community with you. I would also like to respectfully acknowledge and recognize our responsibility to the original and current caretakers of this land, water, and air, the Kawia, Gabrielino Tongva, Luiseño, and Serrano peoples, and all of their ancestors and descendants, past, present, and future. Today, this meeting place is home to many Indigenous peoples from all over the world, including UCR faculty, students, and staff, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on these homelands. Today's conversation marks the third in a series of public programs in conjunction with the exhibition Gail Rebhan, About Time, currently on view at the California Museum of Photography through August 17th. This exhibition was originally organized by the American University Museum in Washington, D.C., where it was on view in 2023. It was curated by Sally Stein, Professor Emerita at the Department of Art History at UC Irvine. And the exhibition is accompanied with a book published by MACC and is available on their website. It's a beautiful book, and you can access it with that QR code. Today's program looks at Gail's work with Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition and brings together the community in Bethesda, Maryland, with another historic Black community close to home here in San Bernardino. It's Valley Truck Farms. Community members and artists from both will engage today in conversation about their collaborative efforts to unearth, remember, and honor these significant Black spaces. One of the artists who you will have a proper introduction to soon, along with all the panelists, is Tamara Cedré. Her exhibition, Tamara Cedré, To Rise Above Ruins, is currently on view at the Riverside Art Museum through September 28th. To Rise Above Ruins takes inspiration from Caribbean poet Derek Walcott, who ruminates on how cultures persist under the threat of erasure and how the process of poetry, like photography, can be one of excavation and self-discovery to reclaim and heal historical wounds. Cedré builds her work upon this notion by creating a visual dialogue between archival materials, advertisements, historical photographs, news articles, family scrapbooks, etc., and her own photographic responses. This exhibition engages past and present to create a photographic commons for Cedré and the communities she calls home in Puerto Rico and Southern California, questioning legacies of empire at a critical moment in our country's history. I hope you will take time to see both exhibitions. The Gail Rebhan exhibition, again, is here at the museum. You'll be able to see it before we close today at 5 o'clock. And then, of course, Riverside Art Museum is just a couple blocks away from us. I'd like to introduce our moderator for this program, Dr. Jen Tilton. Jennifer Tilton is a professor of race and ethnic studies at the University of Redlands. She helps coordinate the Bridges That Carried Us Over project, an archive of Black history in the IE, co-directs a People's History of the IE, and serves as the exhibition chair on the board of the Civil Rights Institute of Inland Southern California. She was one of the lead historians on the Live from the Frontline project and spent a lot of time collaborating with St. Mark's to uncover the rich histories of the Valley Truck Farms community. I'll now hand it over to Dr. Tilton to introduce our panelists.
Great. So I've got here on my far left, Tamara Cedré, who's a lens-based artist and educator who served as the lead artist from Live from the Frontline and collaborated with a team of artists really to document the long history of logistics in the IE, with one site focusing on the Valley Truck Farms community. Her artistic practice employs archives to address issues at the nexus of land, labor, migration, and identity. Tamara received her MFA from Maryland Institute College of Art and has been the recipient of lots of awards and grants from the Center of Creative Citizenship, the Joan Mitchell Foundation, and the California Arts Council. She's currently a visiting professor at Pitzer College and a lecturer at UCLA, and has long taught at Cal State San Bernardino. And she lives and works along the route of the supply chain between LA and the IE, the Inland Empire. Online, we have Dr. Marsha Coleman-Adebayo, who's a civil rights leader, a whistleblower, and an environmental justice activist. As White House EPA liaison to the South African Nelson Mandela government in the 1990s, she exposed an American company's role in poisoning South African miners with vanadium. After the EPA failed to act and retaliated against her, she won a landmark civil rights suit in 2000. Her leadership led to the passage of the 2002 No Fear Act, the first U.S. civil rights and whistleblower protection law of the 21st century. Coleman-Adebayo has been honored by Time Magazine, Good Housekeeping, and the NAACP, and was inducted into Maryland Women's Hall of Fame. She currently serves as the president of Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, which fights the desecration of an African burial ground in Maryland. She's the co-author of No Fear, A Whistleblower's Triumph Over Corruption and Retaliation at the EPA, and she received her AB degree from Barnard College and PhD from MIT. That is quite a bio, I'll just say. Pastor Percy Harper grew up in the Valley Truck Farm community in San Bernardino, where his family attended St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church, a church that just last November celebrated its 96th anniversary. Pastor Harper is the third pastor in that church's history and has served that congregation since 1987. He also went to UCR, so, coming home here to, and was one of the early founders of the BSU at UCR. So, giving a speech here at UCR is appropriate. Gail Rebhan, also online, is a Washington, D.C. based photographer and professor emerita at Northern Virginia Community College. She holds an MFA from the California Institute of the Arts and a BA from Antioch College. Her work explores time, change, gender, aging, race, and the built environment, often combining photography and text in series. A first-generation American-born to Jewish parents who fled Europe during the rise of anti-Semitism. She creates work that documents their and similar families, immigration and assimilation stories. Her art on the Art Bus Project tells immigration and assimilation stories crossing generations and ethnic groups. She also creates photo collages focused on Washington, D.C.'s cultural history and recent self-portraits addressing female aging. Her work has been exhibited widely, including the Lentos Kunstmuseum, Museum Folkwang, and the Blue Sky Gallery. Her first retrospective here at this museum, Gail Rebhan About Time, debuted at American Museum in Washington with an accompanying book by MACC, and she collaborates really actively with Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition, which is what we'll be talking about today. So we're here today to really share two stories of two historic Black communities centered around Black churches to think about how photography can be part of an effort to unearth Black history. They're both kind of these rural farming spaces that offered opportunities to build autonomous Black communities in spaces that were deeply structured by systemic racism. And both communities, as you'll learn, have been radically transformed, almost erased from the landscape by development since the 1960s. But the two churches still stand and are kind of sites of memory and activism and community today. So we're gonna start with the community historians, the community leaders, to tell us a little bit about the history of these communities. And I'm gonna start with Pastor Harper to really ask if you could introduce our audience to the history of the Valley Truck Farm community and St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church, and then a little bit about how this community has been impacted by development and city planning since the 70s.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation to share today. It has been a humbling experience to grow up in a community whereby the community itself was an endemic family environment. When we went back and traced the history, and I'd encourage you to look at what is called the Valley Truck Farm scrapbook that was launched by Alice E.B. Hall, we're really building on the foundation that she laid in terms of this research of all of what foundationally was developed in the Valley Truck Farm history. But saying that, when you go back and you look at the documentation that's on file, whether it's the local Sun Telegram newspaper or the archives in the local library, you discover that the Valley Truck Farm was a 130 plus acre square mile of parsonages that were subdivided by the initial owners of the property and subdivided for the purposes of creating a rural environment for migrants from Los Angeles. I just learned that the original migrants that came from other states to California initially landed, the majority of them, in Los Angeles. And property owners that owned the property in that valley area saw the opportunity to subdivide this 130 plus acre area to create a rural environment for workers that they had in Los Angeles. And then thinking about it, then I recall why so many of the people that ended up in San Bernardino were from other places, were from other areas, including the Norton Air Force Base group that came as a part of that process. But backing up to the 1850s to 60s, I am told that that was formally when this development began to happen. And with that, looking at that very time, the Mill School, which is historic to San Bernardino, was virtually built back in 1856 to 1860. Moving forward in the history of the Valley Truck Farm, in the 30s and 40s, those were the decade periods when the land began to be divided, the parcels began to be separated. And as a result of that, the LA property people began to redirect primarily African American families into this South Waterman area. Being oriented towards cultivating the land, it was a natural habitat for them. The cultivation of land included the development of farming, raising various products from potatoes to black-eyed peas to carrots to corn, you name it, they grew it there with a very diverse type of fruit foundation. I remember vividly as a child, and I'm a latecomer in this process, that everybody in that area had some kind of fruit tree. And as a result of that, the community shared everything that they had, from the foodstuffs to the products that were developed to the skills and abilities that people came with to San Bernardino. It amazed me when I began to look at Ms. Hall's chronology of all of the people that she interviewed and got documentation concerning, that there were many people that came with skills, auto mechanics, retail store owners, hairdressers. There were a number of individuals that literally opened stores during that 30s, 40s period into the early 50s. So the Valley Truck Farm became a self-contained community. The people not only were family oriented, but they were conscious of caring about their community members. Well water was the major source of water for that entire area. So everybody shared from the standpoint of the well water, irrigating the lands and taking care of the livestock and all of those processes. So when you talk about and hear about Valley Truck Farm, it wasn't an isolated rural area with no development, with no sense of organization or systematic approach to living and lifestyle. The foundation of that area was education. And so Mill School caused a critical foundational piece to be inserted early in the life of the Valley Truck.
With the first Black school teacher in San Bernardino County. Yeah. So tell us a little bit about how the community has changed over the years, and we've got a good image to see what it is today, which is different than what you grew up with.
Because again, we talked about the community being developed where the parsonages of properties were anywhere from 300 to 500 different community families now in that area. The school began to become overwhelmed by the major growth that happened with the integration of all of these newcomers. And as a result of it, you've heard the name St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church. We just so happen to be the overload option for the mill school. So classes were held at the St. Mark Missionary Baptist Church to aid in taking care of the educational space needs during that time. With looking at what then began to occur, the development of various other kinds of city plans and options for the area began to become the issue of concern and question. When you look at, again, the 50s and 60s, those were the days and times where the community got settled, the families became united, the people knew everyone. One of the things that I enjoyed in my upbringing there is everybody knew everybody. And today, if you go to the facility where I'm privileged to pastor, you'll see a collage of photographs. And most of the people in those collages either are members of the foundational families or know somebody who's a part of the foundational family. That's the kind of tie that binds and bound this community. And we still promote that same unity and togetherness. In the early 70s, I paged that period as a time when the cities began to plan on what they were going to do with the area. Being the first thing they did, they changed the zoning area from residential to commercial. Unfortunately, we went to sleep during that time and woke up now with a whole different type of challenge. With the city now beginning to activate their plan, they froze the capability of citizens in that area being able to modify or upgrade their home. So now we got people landlocked with limited capability to develop and cultivate what used to be their home, what used to be the property that they used to take care of their livelihood. And so continuing into the late 70s and early 80s, this progress began to progressively take hold of the community. And I'm saying taking hold from the standpoint of the commercialization of it. If you've seen any pictures concerning the before and the after, you can see the drastic change from the rural communities and the farmlands and the kind of housing that was there. And now if you drive through it, you wouldn't recognize it as being the same location. How has it impacted the people? It has virtually dispersed them. With the problem of city rezoning, it was the same period when Kaiser Steel closed. The same time Norton Air Force Base closed. The same time Santa Fe Railroad merged and ultimately sent people who wanted to continue to work for them out of state. So here we have these factors now joining in to the devastation of a used to be self-contained, growing, thriving community. And when you think about, again, the warehousing process, somebody said in the writings of Ms. Hall, well, don't you think that was a great work that they did in bringing all of those jobs into the area? Well, it would have been a great process if they had replaced all the jobs that were displaced in the process. We're talking about a couple of thousand jobs versus 10, 15, as high as 20,000 jobs that literally cause people to be displaced or redirected outside of their comfort zone of their home.
Thank you. Can I turn it over to Dr. Coleman-Adebayo online to tell us a little bit about the history of the River Road Black Colony in Bethesda, Maryland, and the Moses Macedonia Church and Cemetery at its center.
No, thank you. And thank the pastor for such an incredible recitation of what happened to your community. And I'm certainly comparing and contrasting right now the strategies that were used to displace your community with the ones that were used to displace our community. So I'm extremely happy to be here and to participate in this program. Our ancestors were kidnapped from the African kingdoms of Ghana and Mali and San Bernardino, Angola and Congo, and that has that rich background of intellectual challenging and ability to effect resistance through warfare has played such an important role in the struggle of Moses African Cemetery. In fact, what I would say is that in many ways, like your community, the Bethesda African community or the River Road community really represent very interesting patterns and practices of the settler colonial project. And it's just important that our people understand the relationship between all these different patterns. So in Bethesda, we are waging a war against the insidious genocide of memory. During the 17th and 18th centuries, millions of African children left their homes and never returned. These children were kidnapped, forced into hell-like existence that most would not survive. 60% would die before the age of 10 years old. Hundreds of thousands of Africa's children would arrive on the shores of Maryland. And thousands of these children, shackled, bleeding, raped, and near dead, would arrive in what is now one of the wealthiest communities in the United States, Bethesda, Maryland. And thousands would arrive in an area that we call the River Road community. And these children would cling to memories of their parents, siblings, classmates, and their beloved Africa, their beloved land. So the Montgomery County government has attempted to cover up this genocide and the existence of these children, and only to identify them as nameless, faceless, what they like to call us slaves, or non-human people, or non-humans, or chattel. The county continues to allow developers to build a storage unit that's being promoted as the largest self-storage company in the United States on the burial ground of these African children, and to deny any physical evidence or any knowledge of their existence on Earth. So for the last decade, the Bethesda African Cemetery Coalition has brought forth the stories and the warrior spirits of these children and young adults who never lost hope of seeing their families or their beloved Africa again. So land holds many memories and can tell an infinite number of stories. So this story comes from, as I said, one of the wealthiest communities in the United States, namely Bethesda. The wealth of Bethesda was built on the backs of kidnapped African people and their descendants. And this is a story about land, and it's a story about a community that was not called Bethesda by Africans. It was actually called Graceville. It was a Black maroon community that rose from the violence that occurred in Bethesda and the never die spirit that was instilled in African children. And this story is about the strength and ingenuity of a community kidnapped from Africa and brought to America that went on to care for the land and create a thriving collective. This story is also about incredible resistance and resistance that continues by their descendants who continue to fight against white supremacy, erasure, and genocide. So by the 1970s, River Road was lined with four what European historians like to call plantations. We call them what they were. They were death camps that grew tobacco, the primary cash crop for both the United States and Europe. And Africans who came to Bethesda came from advanced agricultural civilizations from West and Central Africa. So there was a need for this kind of technology and knowledge because Europeans, quite frankly, didn't possess such information. And you had major American families like the Loughboroughs, the Councilmans, who were all a part of the early U.S. government, who owned these death camps on River Road. During the post-emancipation period, and by the way, the church that you're going to see, Macedonia, we believe was a part of the Underground Railroad. And so we have adopted Harriet Tubman as our patron saint. During the post-emancipation period, without forced labor and African intellectual knowledge, large farms and estates could not be maintained as large landowners began to sell off some of their acreage, small settlements, to newly freed, liberated Africans who grew up and who continued to take care of the land. And by 1869, the first Black family actually purchased land on River Road. And as I said, they named the community Graysville after Francis and Charlotte Gray, the first generation of liberated Africans to purchase land on River Road. And Graysville resident Tina Clark described much of River Road as marshy, wooded, or poor soil, unfit for farming. However, Africans who came from communities that had experience with agricultural production actually took the same land that Europeans thought was difficult to cultivate and produced yields that were astounding to the white community. And this had two problems. One, it was obviously a great solution for the Africans who lived there, but for the European community, they began to wonder why Africans now owned land that could be productively, agriculturally, an agricultural area. And so it actually made that land more vulnerable to European exploitation. So in this area, you had, an amazing, you, Pastor, you talked about thriving community, but the River Road community was a thriving community. They grew corn and sorghum and tomatoes, and they tended their animals, cows and pigs and goats, and they also created new forms of agricultural production that dealt with producing agricultural products actually from swampland, which was one of the major, I think, contributions of this community that Europeans were still having a lot of trouble with. So these residents, which we call Graysville residents, were hardworking, and they worked on the farms, and they had other professions. They created a thriving school, for example, on River Road. Because of segregation, Black children were not allowed to go to white schools. And so initially, Black children were being taught in the homes of various residents of River Road. but of course, they also wanted, in many ways, to imitate white society, and they wanted their children to go to, quote unquote, a proper school. And so that's a picture of what we call the River Road Colored School, which was a Rosenthal school. And it was a one-room school, basically, and all the children went to that school. And their teachers lived in the community and loved these children, and the children thrived under the protection of community members. Unfortunately, during the integration period, these children were forced out of this kind of loving colored school environment, forced into integrated schools where they were the target of name calling and sort of racial animosity from white students. And that created, obviously a very difficult situation for these children. By the around 1956 to 1960s, the European community, the white community in this area decided that this area, the landmass, was too valuable to have Black people continue to own land there. And so, there was sort of an unholy alliance that was created between the local KKK, Ku Klux Klan organizations, white supremacist organizations, Montgomery County, and the Montgomery County Police Department. And these communities, these members, the families on River Road who had sacrificed so much to purchase land and to make the land productive, were now the targets of the KKK. And we have stories of the KKK dragging fathers primarily out of the home at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, beating them almost to death in front of their families. We have also stories of cross burnings in front of the homes of these Black families, and also kidnapping of Black fathers who were taken to undisclosed locations and beaten until they were forced to sign over their land to white developers. So by the early 1960s, mid 1960s, every Black family on River Road had been displaced. Their land had been stolen by the mid 1960s, and white developers had moved into the area. So the KKK, in fact, where I live in Bethesda, at the corner of the street that I live on, was actually the founding residence of the head of the KKK, or where the KKK actually would meet on a weekly basis. So by the mid-century, the River Road community was zoned, like your community, for commercial use for the first time. And the River Road community was completely displaced. The Washington Sanitary Commission, of course, every method that you can imagine was used. Not only the KKK and the police department and city government, but even the water and sanitation department commission was utilized to force Black people out of their homes. One had to, for example, one tactic that was used by the Water and Sanitation Commission was that Black families, to a large extent, used external sanitation techniques. They had what are called outhouses. And of course, this is around the period of time when indoor plumbing was becoming prevalent. For white families, they were given an opportunity to pay over an extended period of time. Black families were forced to achieve indoor plumbing in one payment, and most of the Black families could not afford to do that. And so, even at the level of a utility company, Black families were being pushed out of their homes. So our community, or at least our church, Macedonia Baptist Church, comes into the process around 2008. We knew at that point our community is totally dispersed. The oral history is sort of spread throughout Maryland and Virginia and Washington, D.C. And my husband and I, who do not come from this area, had very little knowledge of why this little Black church was literally sitting in the middle of an affluent white community. And when I became First Lady, my first job was to go to a meeting at the Maryland Regional Parks and Planning Department. And basically there was a sector plan that was that they required our signature. At least they required some kind of acknowledgement that the commission had at least involved the church in some way, had it informed us about the sector plan. And one of the first things that the director said to me was, "You may have heard a rumor that there's a cemetery in your neighborhood," and I just want to dispel that rumor. At this meeting, as far as we know, there's no African cemetery in your area. And there was a man sitting next to me who was one of the deacons of our church, and he raises his hand and he goes, I just want everyone here to know that that's not a rumor, that I used to play in that Black cemetery as a child. And I played in a cemetery because Montgomery County didn't allow Black children to play in parks. And so the cemetery became our park. And so I have personal firsthand knowledge that that was a cemetery. And I looked around the room and I could tell that people were like, "Oh my God, where did this guy come from?" They were unhappy that there was a firsthand account of the cemetery. And so the question that I had, which is the question that still haunts all of us to this day, is that if there's a cemetery across the street from our church and you don't know about the cemetery, or you're telling me that the cemetery didn't exist, then where are the bodies of the members of our congregation? And at that point, I could tell they were just astounded by that question. They didn't want to answer it. So then I said, instead of talking about a sector plan, I think we have a crime scene on our hands, and we need to find out what happened to this community. Well, the first member of our church, the pastor of this little white church, which we call a church on a hill, is actually buried under a parking lot, because what the county did was when after they were able to displace the entire Black community, they began to desecrate the African cemetery attached to the church. And one portion of the cemetery is now under a parking lot for an apartment building. Another portion of the cemetery is now being desecrated to create a self-storage company. And all of this is under the watchful eye of what is considered a progressive Democratic administration in Montgomery County. And not a single politician in our area has stepped forward to denounce the desecration. And the member of our area, who's quite famous, at least in Washington, his name is Jamie Raskin, and I think he's a presidential hopeful. And the cemetery is actually located in his district, but he will not denounce the desecration and the displacement of the African community on River Road. So we are at battle. We're fighting, and we hold demonstrations every week. We just won a major Maryland Supreme Court victory, where the Maryland Supreme Court has now determined that Moses African Cemetery is a legitimate cemetery, and that the descendants have a right to file for equitable relief against the people who are desecrating our cemetery. We also have a circuit court victory under our belt as well. And we have 3 other lawsuits against developers who are desecrating our cemetery. And we have tried very hard to organize our community to stop the desecration of this sacred ground. So I'll stop there.
Very powerful stories. Thank you for sharing all of that with us. I'd love to actually turn to the photographers a little bit because we've collaborated with photographers in both of these communities. And maybe we can start with TK to just talk a little bit about how you've used photography and video art to support efforts to document and uncover the rich history of the Valley. And then we'll turn to Bethesda.
Okay, thanks, Jen. Can you hear me? We worked with a People's History, the IE. They're an archiving group with historians Jennifer Tilton, Audrey Mayer, Catherine Gudis. They had already been well underway documenting what was happening with St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church. And we were really excited when we won a grant to be able to actually come alongside the church and document with them. And they had such an incredible, they opened up their scrapbooks, they opened up their homes, they gave us, oral stories, and we felt like it was important to preserve that. But even with that, working in that project, we kind of wanted to approach it in a different way than just scanning their images and listening and recording stories. We wanted to sort of I wanted to work with 2 Black artists from the area to also document with the church. I felt like that was really important. And I worked with Jonathan Arthurs, who's here with his wonderful family. I also worked with Adrian Matoyer, who did a lot of the drone work that you just saw. And I felt like that was really important because in my work, I was working in a kind of social critique of what was happening to this community, empowering people in the surrounding area to think about policy change, because this, was about the erasure of a Black community and another Black congregational space that was disappearing. In my own work, I've talked about the disappearance of these spaces, these Black congregational spaces in Puerto Rico. I currently live in Compton, where even as today, as we speak, there's, National Guard and, police in our streets right now that have historically been used and weaponized against people that live there. So this was something that was really close to me. But working with Jonathan, what was amazing was if I was doing sort of the social critique of what was happening to this farming community, and helping to document some of the stories from the elder, congregation, he was working to sort of uplift them and show color portraits to show the joy of this community that was still there. That even through all of this, they were a tight-knit, warm, welcoming community. And so my partner and I, Adrian, we were documenting sort of everything that was happening around the area, the warehouse, the church doors opening out to warehouses, the fact that that aerial image that you saw of it being surrounded by white buildings. We were working on the side of social critique. We published an article in the Black Voice News to alert the community to what was happening. As we were doing that, Jonathan was alongside of us, taking portraits of all of the members of the church, which were beautiful and in color, and we'll see those probably after this group. Yeah, this one here. So, which was a really interesting contrast, because when we went to install it into the church and we went to work with them to publish the work, it was really nice to see both sides. One was that we are resisting, we are here trying to change the course of what's happening in our community, being overtaken by warehouses and industrial development, but we also have vibrant culture that's still here. So it was an incredible experience. Pastor Harper was and still is such an incredible inspiration, and all the people in the church were so warm and welcoming and so thoughtful with their responses. I spent, I think, so many weekends with Vera White Seville and you know, the Overstreets and just all of the, you know, Pastor Harper, Deacon Jackson, you know, just they are so overwhelmingly generous with their stories. And ultimately, even though the building, you know, we don't know the precarity of, you know, the building and if it will close or what will happen with the church, but we do know this community is still very tight knit. And so the work kind of functions in two ways. One is to celebrate this community that has been here for 97 years and that will continue to be in this community, but also as a kind of critique that this disappearance of Black spaces is, you know, part of my show To Rise Above Ruins was to kind of show that it's happening in Puerto Rico. It's happening in, you know, all across the country. Now we hear about the desecration of this cemetery in Bethesda, that this is something that, you know, is kind of like, it's consistently happening. It is the pattern that we have to be awake and aware of.
Thank you. Gail Rebhan, can you talk a little bit about how you use your photography to support the BACC movement and to unearth and make visible that particular history?
So the image that you see here was done for the 100th anniversary of the Macedonia Baptist Church, and it's to show again. There's the current congregation is literally and figuratively standing on the shoulders of their ancestors. A lot of the work that I do is documenting the desecrations. As Marsha mentioned, one of the parcels is starting in, I think, 2020. There's this excavation that was done. They were supposed to screen the soil. So I took like about 2 or 3 times a week, I went and photographed the desecration. A lot of my pictures have been used as evidence in court, some of the court cases that Marsha was talking about. This is unscreened soil that is being removed. They were supposed to have archaeologists, but they were contract archaeologists. The soil was not screened. I have photographs of funerary objects, bottles that were found. I photographed it on a Friday, and when I went there on Saturday, it was gone. Maybe you could go back a couple of slides. And so this is King Tofa, who is pouring a libation at the cemetery. You can see it's a parking lot. So I photographed the desecration, a lot of the rallies and protests that are going on. And they've been widely distributed in social media and as well as mainstream media, the Black Agenda Report, Black News Tonight, Montgomery Magazine, NBC News, WTOP. You could go to the next slide. This is Jamie Raskin that Marsha was referencing. He did on Juneteenth in 2023. He came to the Juneteenth celebration. He saw the desecration. That's Marsha talking to him, showing him what is going on. So I give my photographs to BACC. They choose which ones to distribute. Then you can go to the next one, the next slide. We have exhibitions. We had a very important exhibition. It's a similar name. It's interesting. The bridge that carried us over at American University. So the Coke bottle and those other the glass, those are artifacts that were found when the dump trucks came. BACC members followed the dump trucks. They were dumped into a landfill, and excavated, found all these objects in 20 minutes before they were told that they had to leave because it was private property. And the archaeologists claimed to have found nothing. So we had an exhibition that talks about the history of the church. You see one of the gowns of the church. I helped a lot with organizing the exhibition. A lot of my documentary photographs are in the exhibition, and you can see people looking at the exhibition. We also have a wonderful catalog that tells the whole history of River Road that accompanied the exhibition. So my photographs are used in many different ways. This is a photograph of one of the court cases, taken at the Maryland Supreme Court in Annapolis, where we really filled the chambers. And this is what, unfortunately, it looks like now, that there's a self-storage unit, which is like to store the junk you can't fit in your house. So it's current desecration that is going on. And these are some of the weekly rallies. This is from the most recent one, to protest to save Moses Cemetery, where we rally along River Road and try to let people know about what is going on.
Great, thank you. So we're, of course, running a little over time, but I'm going to ask one kind of question for Dr. Cole-Adebayo and Pastor Harper to really to talk to us a little bit about what it has meant for you to collaborate with these photographers in this kind of ongoing work. And maybe then we can open it up to the audience and kind of, and what your hopes are and fight is moving forward. Do you want to go first, Dr. Coleman-Adebayo?
Absolutely. I wanted just to make it clear, as you might be, what you don't see in the photographs is how much we are harassed by police and by security guards, and how many times, we've all been attacked, physically attacked, emotionally attacked. And so our struggle is not in many ways sort of the usual struggle of, a couple of tombstones being turned over and the police called to try to find out who turned over a couple. I mean, this is frontline work that we're doing, and it comes at great risk, physical risk. And because the storage company has said that they've spent now over $100 million to build the storage unit, and the county is in bed with the developer, it is really the community against what we consider capitalism. It really is the community against the entire system of profit making over human needs. And so in that context, the work that Gail has done has not come without risk. And initially, when she started going to the site early in the morning and taking pictures, I think that the construction workers just thought she was sort of a nosy neighbor who wanted to take pictures of this site. And then as they began to realize that she was really taking these pictures, these photographs on behalf of the descendant community, their attitude towards her started to change. And I can't tell you how many times, I waited up to hear Gail's voice as she was leaving the cemetery to make sure that that she was okay, that she had not been attacked, physically attacked by the security guards that are hired by the developer. So she's, one of the things that Gail said is that her photographs have been used in our case at the Maryland Supreme Court, at the Circuit Court, in the 3 cases that we now have before the court system. So we have used her photographs, and because our cemetery is totally desecrated, as you can see, the only images we have right now are the images that Gail has taken or other photographers have taken. Without those images, we would not have a record of of the items that came out of the excavation. We have tombstones, we have, coffin tops, we have pieces of clothing, we have a shoe that we think was most likely worn by, a member of our community that was excavated. And it was Gail's camera that took, I believe, was that your picture of the shoe, Gail?
No, I don't think that one is mine.
That was another photographer. But because of the photography, we actually have pictures, we have images of of the desecration. And this is one of the worst desecrations occurring in the United States right now. And so that work has centered our legal work. It's centered our telling of this story. It's centered in many ways our scholarship. We've written 3 books about the desecration of Moses Cemetery. And I think our most popular book is the what I consider like a coffee table book. It's sort of a large book that has most of the pictures, I'm sure, are Gail's pictures. And everyone loves to look at these pictures because, they tell the story of what happened to those little girls, what happened to the community. And I just wanted to make one other mention that I didn't talk about initially, and that is after 1807, when the soils were exhausted because of tobacco production, the councilmen and Lophmore boroughs, they went into breeding little African girls, and that became the industry on River Road. And so one of the reasons why Montgomery County is so invested in, crushing and making sure the story is never told, because on some level, this is also the story of these little girls who were used to produce children or babies for the cotton producing South. And 60% of these little girls would bleed out in childbirth, and their bones were thrown into Moses African Cemetery. And so the county and the state is invested in making sure that no one knows this history of what happened to these little girls. And we actually have research now that indicates as early as 4 years old, these girls were being used for gentlemen's parties on the weekends. So the photography, even though we can't have photography going back that far, we do have pictures of the remains that were unearthed during the excavation. We have pictures of tombstone. We have pictures that now guide our research and help the public connect to human beings, and not just words, but pictures and images. And that is critically important for us to continue to fight and to tell the story of this community.
Thank you. Maybe we can ask Pastor a little bit. Different history, different story, but what does it mean to you to collaborate with photographers to keep this history alive and to do this work together?
We have been overwhelmingly blessed that God would lay in our laps a collaborative like Live from the Front Line. We were preparing our annual celebration of what God has done each year for the St. Mark Church. And as we were getting ready to celebrate this past year, Jen and company rolled up like nobody's business and literally laid out for us a ways and means of capturing what we had been talking about doing for 20 years. I'm not exaggerating. And as a result of this collaborative, which is a continuation of what Alice Hall started, we have experienced a monumental progressive work effort that has captured so much of the history of where we've been planted, the Valley Truck Farm, and so many of the families that were planted there as a part of the now 90 plus years of God doing so. When you look at these photos and you look at some of the foundational families, the Green family, the Overstreet family, you see also, again, the Green family, one of the large families in terms of numerical production. But more critically, they were instrumental in laying the foundation for development and growth and community. The youngest child in the Green family is one of my best friends in life.
Mm.
We still communicate now. We grew up together at St. Mark's Missionary Baptist Church. And this is the kind of format and framework that God fixed for us, that Live from the Front Line said, we're going to help you capture this. We're going to help you record this. We're going to make sure that in the posterity of your serve, this doesn't get lost in the warehouse jungle. When you look at photos like this and you see little girls dressed up for Sunday go to meeting, and realize that was the ongoing practice in that day. And to think about again, all that this collaborative did for us, this sky view of the church, again, looking from north to south where we're planted across the street, things look different from the air. You were able to see more. Anybody been on a plane ride? You're able to see more based on the altitude. And those who have not been exposed to photography like this, they're wow, this is incredible. They're looking at the same place from ground level and looking at it now from the elevated level. You see more of what has happened over the past, particularly just the last decade plus. And so this collaborative effort is, again, far more than we can see just with the naked eye. It has become a bond of God in bringing common burden and concern together to continue the work of not only capturing our history as God is producing it, but in taking the time to make sure those who are laboring with us now and those who will continue to labor with us become exposed to this kind of history of where we're planted and what God did before we came on the scene. I tell people, I'm simply an after product. The major work was done before I showed up. I'm simply a part of the cleanup, the mop-up crew. But all of that to simply say, when you look at these depictions and you look at the valley and you look at the agricultural framework and format and you look at the love, this is part of the Overstreet family. Annette, who is also a part of the Green family you saw before, that's her mom and dad and all of her siblings, her daughter Rosalind, these Myrna, these are the ones that, again, when you want to hear about the whole story, these are the ones that can tell it, because their families are inextricably bound together in the history of that South Waterman community. So when I see pictures like this, I thank God again for the collaborative. I praise God for his love for us, to infuse in us this opportunity to share with these great professionals in what they do. And I don't use that term loosely.
Thank you so much for being here. This is such an important conversation. Thank you to the panelists for being here and sharing about the important work you're doing.
And thank you so much for sharing all the stories with our folks from our folks online. Really, really powerful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.